Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Study, and welcome especially to the Chinese community who is celebrating the Year of the Red Pig this week. And I hope it may bring us all luck. We certainly need it. My name is Karina Urbach. I'm a historian of modern Europe and the convener of this lecture series. For those of you who haven't attended the first two lectures, the idea of this series is quite simple. We want to look at very topical problems of today through the lens of history. And we asked very simple questions, but the answers are going to be quite difficult. We talked about America in the first lecture, then we had somebody talking about the CIA, and in our last lecture we are going to tackle Europe and Brexit. But today we have one of the most important historians on modern China who is going to help us understand Asia and its problems. And you probably have heard of Rana before, but just to introduce him briefly, he's the professor of the history of politics of modern China. He also runs the Center of China in Oxford. He is a great commentator, and if you are a fan of the BBC, you have heard him presenting on BBC Three a lot. He also commented on China at great events like the World Economic Forum in Davos. And of course, he has written lots of books on China, and I'm just going to mention three of them. The Manchurian Myth, that was the first one, then a book about modern China, and then China's War with Japan, 1937 to 1945, which won the Duke of Westminster Medal. His father, I have heard from Glenn Bowersock, was already a member at the Institute, but worked on something completely different. He was an art historian, and it's wonderful to have now Rana here, who is so eminent with his work on Asia. And please welcome Rana.
Thank you very much indeed, Karina, for an extremely warm welcome. Thank you for all that you and the team at the IAS have done to make this such a smooth and enjoyable visit. Thank all of you for coming here on this rather spring-like February evening. I'm pleasantly surprised, perhaps I should be worried about the fact that it's so warm on the East Coast in February. And also, it's a pleasure, as Karina mentioned here, I should say, to be back at the IAS, since my first memories of it were as an 11-year-old when my father was a member here, and I remember playing out on the grass outside, and also using some of the world's finest historians, who are, of course, here then as they are now, to fill in the gaps in my history homework from high school. So never say that the IAS isn't good for all sorts of purposes. I want today to talk about China, but also about a particular aspect of China's history and China's past, which I think in the West we often don't pay enough attention to. And that is the experience and the legacy of China's devastating mid-century wars, particularly the war against Japan, which we know of course, as one of the sections of the Asian part of World War II. And I do that in the spirit of this series of lectures to try and make a point not just about the past, but also about the present and about where China and the world are going. And I might illustrate that, if I may, with two different images. The first one is one that I got to see at fairly close quarters when I was in Beijing on this date on the 3rd of September 2015. I should add I did not take this picture, which is from a news agency, but I did get to see this parade close up. Since this was a military parade held in Tiananmen Square, the symbolic and literal heart of the Chinese capital, Beijing, scene, of course, of many political parades, and also, of course, the dreadful killings of 1989, which still remain very famous in contemporary history. But this event was unusual because it was held on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. And in the West, you might remember, in that summer of 2015, there were a fair number of events commemorating the end of the Second World War. More of them, to be frank, at least if the United Kingdom is anything to go by, commemorating the European war than the war in Asia, even though, of course, the United States and Britain were very much involved in that Asian war. But this was unusual because China, the People's Republic of China, had not previously done this sort of major public commemoration of World War II. And in the midst of the parade, the things that were most noticeable, the things that were most commented on by certainly the Western press, were the huge array of Chinese soldiers who were parading past the reviewing stand at the front, in front of President Xi Jinping. Intriguingly, of course, many of those from countries including Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Algeria, which showed the way in which new alliances are being created across Eurasia and beyond by China. People noticed the weaponry. They also noticed the wide range, but rather selective range of world leaders who came to this particular parade. President Park Geun-hye of South Korea, who is these days detained elsewhere, as they say, but at that point was free to come to various events. There was also, of course, the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, and of course President Vladimir Putin. So that said something quite interesting about the alliances China was making. But compared to all of those, there was one particular event, it was quite a short event, during the middle of the parade on 3rd of September 2015, that I thought that more than anything was indicative of the changing way in which China has come to think about its Second World War experience. And that was the parade in carefully covered vehicles in the middle of the ceremony of 8 veterans, 8 very old men, aged between 90 and 102. I hope nobody in this audience is insulted by my categorizing that as being relatively aged. I would say of a distinguished age, perhaps. Between 90 and 102, who had all fought in China's World War II against Japan. But those veterans, 4 of them, were from the armies of the Chinese Communist Party, the 8th Route Army, the new 4th Army, and 4 of them were from the nationalist armies of Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party of China, who, far from being publicly paraded through most of the history of the People's Republic, were regarded essentially as reactionaries who had fought for an unworthy cause and been essentially consigned to a historical black hole. The journey that had taken place to allow them not only to be rehabilitated, but to be paraded in front of the President of the People's Republic of China, in front of national television watched by hundreds of millions of people, was a very important indication of the change in the way in which China was looking at its wartime past. And that, of course, in 2015 coincided with another major set of changes, then only 2 or 3 years old, and still very much with us in the present day in 2019. And that is this, the building of what has variously been called the New Silk Road, or in the more officially used Chinese translation, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Many of you, all of you perhaps, will know that this is a highly ambitious plan in which, if all goes as the Chinese state wishes it to, something like $8 trillion worth of infrastructural investment will be provided by Chinese actors, not necessarily the Chinese state, but certainly coordinated from China, to build infrastructure ranging from power stations to ports to, indeed, military facilities, all the way across the Eurasian continent, and now, indeed, in even further off sites such as the east coast of Africa. It's indicative that one of the terms that is used about this, actually more by foreigners than by the Chinese, is China's Marshall Plan. Now, for reasons I'll go into a little later, China is actually not very keen to use this term, the New Marshall Plan, to describe the New Silk Road Initiative, not least since those of you who know some Chinese history will be aware that General George Marshall did indeed turn up in China in 1946 and 47 and was not immensely successful in terms of trying to mediate the Civil War. So his reputation is perhaps less high in China than it is in Western Europe. But the fact that this particular Second World War analogy is being used about a major contemporary Chinese project is another indication of the way in which the legacies of that war, both in China and internationally, are coming together to provide frameworks of interpretation, some valid and some, I think, somewhat tenuous for what's going on. So let me, if I may, explain briefly what it is that I hope to try and illustrate in today's talk. I think that it is immensely important for those who want to understand China's domestic and international actions and behavior today to go back to a period which Chinese historians and think tankers and policymakers and military strategists are looking at today in China in great detail and with increasing urgency. And that is an analysis of China's place in the post-1945 world. It's become something of a cliche, particularly after the election of President Donald Trump, that the post-1945 international liberal order is being shaken up or rethought or re-engineered in all sorts of perhaps unpredictable ways. If there is any, what we might call sort of historically beneficial element to that rethinking, it perhaps comes with understanding more than we have tended to do in the West that China and Chinese interests and motivations were a much more central part of those debates in and after 1945 than perhaps we've realized. And there are important, not repetitions, but echoes of those debates of 70 years ago in the China of today. The first is the question of involvement with international organizations. It will have escaped the notice of none of you that one of only 5 countries in the world to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council is, of course, China. And that is very much a product of the world of 1945. But it is also a subject of huge debate today, as China, a country which, on the one hand, has more UN peacekeepers active in the world, at least in terms of total numbers, than any other country, but also, of course, has deep and, in some ways, fundamental misgivings about the international order, is considering what exactly its role in those organizations might be. The second factor, I think, that is important is China's role as both an exemplar and an active player in creating the post-imperialist world. In 1945, we are, of course, talking about nationalist China, Kuomintang China, under Chiang Kai-shek. The communists, of course, come along quite soon afterwards, but it's important, I think, to remember that they were not the first Chinese actor to take part in those anti-imperialist debates. And that, of course, has a great deal of the echo that happens today when we go back to that New Silk Road idea of China seeking to be a mentor to a section of the world which perceives itself as not wanting to follow, to use a sort of convenient, if slightly overly slick shorthand, Washington consensus. The third point is that the 1945 Asian world, with China very much at its heart, was riven by constitutional and political debates at home about what kind of society China should be and what kind of society post-colonial Asian and indeed non-Asian countries should be in general as well. Sometimes we have reduced the argument, I think, too simply to debates between liberal democracies and everything else, conveniently pigeonholed under the term authoritarianism, which can cover everything from imperial personalistic dictatorships to alternative non-democratic systems run by a party state. And those debates, of course, have huge relevance to China today as it seeks to create its own Chinese domestic order. But at the same time, it's worth remembering that, for instance, constitutional debates in the late 1940s, before the communist victory in China, were also rethinking and reworking debates that had gone on in China really since the mid-19th century. And finally, last but not least, an issue which is certainly of huge importance today, not just in China, but in all large, fast-developing, but economically unequal societies. How much welfare, how much of a safety net can and should be provided in an era when perhaps the comforting blanket of the Western European social democratic welfare state is barely affordable, it would sometimes seem, by those Western European states, let alone by anyone else. Certainly Chinese debates about healthcare and about pensions in what is certainly not a social democracy, but might be called a social dictatorship, in many ways echoes very similar debates, as I hope I'll illustrate in just a few minutes, that emerged from China's wartime experience, and very much that moment after 1945 when China thought carefully about how to insert itself into global debates on these questions, very much as it is doing today. So let me move, if I may, having laid out a little bit of where I would like to take us, let me move to the question of how the past, and the quite recent past, affected these questions. And at the heart of that has to sit the experience of China in the Second World War. Audiences far less informed than this one, I know, have sometimes spoken to me afterwards, or members of them have spoken to me afterwards, and said that they were grateful for a lecture because they hadn't actually been aware that China was in World War II. I can actually reveal in this hall that the most recent of these conversations I had was when I arrived at Kennedy Airport a couple of days ago, where I discovered to my delight that the immigration officer had no interest in taking my fingerprints, but wanted to, when he heard what I was coming here to talk about, engage in a discussion about China's role in World War II, having stated that he had never at school heard or learnt about this particular event. And he explained that he had spent a lot of time watching shows and reading books about the Second World War. So at least I have one more purchaser, I think, on Amazon for my books. But it's a set of events that is well worth remembering, regardless of what your opinions are about contemporary China. The devastating and transformative nature of the Second World War in China is topped perhaps only by the experience of the Soviet Union, which, of course, was pushed essentially to the brink of near non-existence. I think that was probably not quite the extent to which China was pushed, but certainly the future of nationalist China, the Chinese state at the time, was in very, very dire straits during much of that time. It was, of course, the longest theatre of World War II, beginning with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 and lasting 8 years till 1945. Although statistics from the war years are frankly very, very unstable, reasonable estimates put the number of deaths, both civilian and military, between 8 and 14 million. Statistics also in recent research done by scholars such as Stephen McKinnon suggest 80 to 100 million Chinese becoming refugees in their own country during that period. Figures which in some ways dwarf those in the parts of Europe with which we have become perhaps more familiar in recent years, and certainly comparable to those. They also, of course, in a sense, created the doom spiral, the death spiral, for the regime of this man, Chiang Kai-shek, now a relatively secondary, relatively forgotten figure in global history, but at that time, of course, the face of Chinese nationalism and of a fitful modernization that was essentially stopped in its tracks and torn into pieces by the experience of the Second World War. During that time, it's worth, if I may, very briefly, just recapping on the key events of what happened during that period. And anyone who would like more on the day-to-day detail, I would encourage you to get a copy of my book, which is available at all good bookstores and some bad ones as well. Essentially, the clash between China and Japan, which would eventually become, after Pearl Harbor, part of what we know as the Second World War in Asia, was initially the showdown between two major ideological forces which shaped the East Asian subcontinent during the late 19th and early 20th century. The rise of Chinese nationalism on the mainland of China through the pushback against Western imperialism, the Opium Wars, the arrival of the Russians, of course, the Russo-Japanese War, and then the emergence of movements such as the so-called May 4th nationalist movement in the 1910s that saw young, patriotic Chinese trying to argue that China's weak imperial state, which had collapsed after the abdication of the last emperor in the 1911 revolution, would be replaced by a republic, which then turned out to be deeply problematic, deeply flawed, and essentially very quickly fell apart into warlord or militarist rule. The other ideological force, of course, just inconveniently off the edge of the map there, was the rise of Japanese imperialism. Japan, of course, modernizing with immense speed after the Meiji Restoration of 1898. But 1898, what the hell am I talking about? That's completely wrong. Sorry, that was the Chinese reforms, I was saying. The Meiji Restoration of 1868. But despite, of course, modernizing with new constitution, new military, new systems of education and government, also Japan sought to create an empire, a territorial empire in its own right, and the Chinese mainland was one of the primary sites for that. So between 1895 and 1931, you see the slow but steady encroachment of Japan's empire to Taiwan, to Korea, to the southern tip of northeastern China, then known as Manchuria, and finally after 1931, the invasion and occupation of all of Manchuria, meaning that by 1937, when yet another confrontation came outside Beijing, the government of Chiang Kai-shek, as he records in his own diary, felt they had no choice but to push back against Japan, thereby starting what became the Second World War in Asia. The campaigns basically spread very quickly from North China to East Central China with a huge showdown at Shanghai in late 1937. And China's nationalist government then moved upriver very quickly, 800 miles, to the inland city of Chongqing in southwest China, which would remain the temporary capital for the rest of the war and into 1946. The Chinese communists, of course, who had been very much at daggers drawn with the nationalists and had retreated on the famous Long March of 1934 to 35, were present in northwestern China and joined an uneasy alliance with the nationalists after 1937. But it's the story of the nationalists and the Chiang Kai-shek government that I want to keep an eye on for the next few minutes, largely because, in a sense, the communist story, a very interesting, very important one, has ended up becoming rather dominant in post-war understandings of China for the very good reason that the communists eventually, of course, won the Civil War and took over the mainland of China and, of course, have been there ever since in various forms. And therefore, the story of China's wartime experience, in as much as there's been one in the West, has mostly been about the emergence of a peasant revolution in parts of China in wartime conditions, which eventually led to the conquest of the entire mainland. This has sort of relegated the actual, the mainstream, as it were, government of China, the nationalist government, to a somewhat secondary position. And it's worth remembering quite how major the experience and the traumas were that that government had to undergo while maintaining its resistance against Japan. Bearing in mind that until Pearl Harbor, until the formal entry of the United States and the British Empire into the war in Asia, China had a certain amount of limited and unofficial assistance both from the Soviets and the British and the Americans, but in terms of official allies, it was essentially on its own during that time. And while Chongqing, the wartime capital city, was chosen both because it's accessible via two major rivers, the Yangtze and the Jialing, but it's very inaccessible by land, so it can't be invaded easily because it's on top of cliffs. This did not mean that it was free from attack by the most important new method of warfare, which was not started with, but which came of age during the Second World War, and that, of course, was the terror bombing of civilians in occupied, in inhabited cities. The London Blitz, of course, would become immensely famous just a few years later in 1940, but before that, the terror bombing, the Blitz, you might say, over Chongqing became a part of everyday existence in China's temporary capital, starting in early 1938 and really carrying on until the Americans were able to come into the war fully after 1941 and protect Chongqing's skies. So scenes like this became an everyday reality, in particular during the spring and summer months. In winter, Chongqing is covered by fog. Today it's more like a sort of polluted smog, I have to say, that essentially meant that it was somewhat protected from Japanese bombers being able to find their targets. But during the summer months, when the fog had cleared, essentially the city, which had very few air raid defences, was a sitting target for repeated raids, one of the most terrifying, taking place over 2 days, the 3rd and 4th of May 1939, when 27 sorties were made, essentially in a continuous series by Japanese bombers, both with conventional and incendiary bombs on the city, destroying some 6,000 lives and 12,000 buildings. The date was particularly symbolic for those of you who know modern Chinese history, because of course it was exactly 20 years after the student demonstrations, the patriotic student demonstrations of 4th of May 1919, which gave their name to the so-called May 4th nationalist movement in China. And one of China's greatest modern writers, Lao She, who was actually living just outside Chongqing at the time, wrote an essay on exactly that topic called What the Real May 4th Means, very much a sort of hymn of defiance to the attacks and invaders. Meanwhile, the government itself found that it was having to deal, obviously, with the constant reconstruction and reconditioning of buildings which could be wiped out in a flash like this. But despite that, the nationalist government was making efforts to try and find ways to create some new sense of shared and collective identity. Something much harder to do in a country which, of course, at that time was immensely agrarian and was also, of course, politically deeply split. We're talking here about the Chinese nationalists and their resistance. I've mentioned the Chinese communists, but also, of course, large parts of eastern China were occupied and under the government of Chinese collaborators, most notably the former nationalist politician Wang Jingwei. So one of the ways, I think, to think about China at this time is as a battlefield in the literal sense, but also a battlefield for ideas about what a post-war China was going to look like, either as a state under a new Japanese Axis form of empire, in which white nations and their imperialism, as it was put, would be expelled from Asia, but Japan instead would provide a new empire in reality, if not in name. Or, of course, the communist radical social change, which eventually would become the winner. But at that time, one of the major experiments was also the one taking place under the nationalist government, in which a combination of a kind of vanguardist party state combined with new thinking about collective responsibilities that governments had to citizens was getting underway. So this document from the Chongqing Municipal Archives from 1941 is one example of the actions being taken to try and implement that idea of creating a new sense of mutual obligation between state and citizen. Those of you who read Chinese, which is several of you here, I think, will see that we have on the right-hand side here a little label that this is the Chongqing Food Management Committee's air raid damage report. And at the top you have a list of personal items this person has lost: a bed, quilt, some shoes, what's happened to them, completely destroyed, and the value that should be given in terms of compensation. Now, this one document is one example of a much wider phenomenon that we see in the reconstructing of wartime nationalist China, which is the idea that the state has obligations to citizens whom it is also squeezing in many ways for extra taxation revenue, for conscription of young men into the armed forces, or essentially for corralling into labor for war industries. And in that sense, there is a very kind of global element to what you see here. This is, of course, in a country that, in terms of economics and in terms of industrialization, is nowhere near the capacity of a Britain or a Soviet Union or a United States. But it is very recognizably a country that is having some of the same arguments and discussions, including the question about how a wartime state, which makes more and more demands of its population, also has to provide more compensation to them as well. In the immediate short term, this happened in a variety of ways. One example here of work relief schemes being created for the millions and millions of refugees who fled from occupied eastern China into the so-called free China zone, and then, of course, found themselves without employment. So creating employment became a very important part of that mixture. A whole variety of propaganda activities were undertaken by the national government to try and create that sense of shared identity. Here you have women very explicitly being brought into the war effort, the Torchlight Parade there, as supporters of the overall war effort. And here even, of course, the younger members of society being brought into the idea of the militarization of society as a whole. It's also notable that in a whole variety of other areas, we see reforms and changes taking place that at first glance look small scale, almost trivial, but actually really aren't. And the example that I like to use, and which I've written about somewhat, is the almost obsession with public health and hygiene in the nationalist areas of China during this time. Lots of money is spent on disinfecting places that have extremely poor sewage, and also dealing with the spread of diseases including cholera, trachoma, and so forth. And there's a very good reason for this. One is that symbolically, conquering disease fulfills the requirements of what the historian Ruth Rogaski has called hygienic modernity. In other words, the idea that a modern industrializing state also has to be a clean and disease-free state. But also, on a very practical level, this is one of the cheapest things you can do when you have a government and a society that's constantly being bombed, that's running out of tax revenue, that has an increasingly large and difficult to maintain military. The chances of undertaking very large, expensive reforms during that period are frankly pretty limited, whereas, of course, taking buckets of disinfectants, or in the words of one document I'm particularly fond of, renewing toilets for national purposes, which I think gives a whole new definition to patriotism, is what you can actually meaningfully and demonstrably do in the short term with very low budgets. So to some extent, I think the push towards hygienic change is an example of the practical side of the new social contract that the nationalists were trying to undertake. But there was, of course, one other very important element of what they were seeking to do. If the items I've mentioned just now were to do with changing a domestic social contract, there was also a realization that a country that was, pretty much on its uppers, that was pushing the last of its resources, human and financial, into a war machine in which, until 1941, it really appeared that no assistance was coming, meant that international and foreign assistance had to become a central part of the way in which the Chinese state would regenerate itself. And this is one example of a kind of wartime campaign to try, or indeed succeed, in getting donations and offerings from foreign supporters for the Chinese war effort against the Japanese. But it manifested itself in the last years of the war into something that would morph into the way in which China would ask much bigger questions about how it would engage with the post-war world. And the vehicle for that, there are many vehicles for that, but the one that I want to highlight now is this one. An organization many of you will have know of it, of course, called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. UNRWA is, of course, one of the great humanitarian organizations, efforts of the 20th century, and the amount of money and time that it spent on regenerating large parts of southern and eastern Europe during and then after the Second World War is, of course, one of the best remembered parts of that experience. It's known, but far less researched, at least in the Western scholarship, that UNRWA was, of course, in China as well. And in terms of single country donations, China actually received more funding from UNRWA than any other single state. It did so in collaboration with an emergent domestic agency, which was called CINRA, essentially the same initials, but with C for China rather than UN for United Nations at the beginning. So China National Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, run by the sometime historian and then ambassador and bureaucrat Jiang Tingfu. And on the one hand, the $600 million worth of aid that was provided to China through UNRWA in 1943 to 47 was a large drop in the bucket. It was not irrelevant by any means, it was very serious, but it certainly didn't cover all of the need to try and deal with the reality of a devastated China, a country which looked in some ways much more like Eastern Europe than Western Europe in 1945, with its marketing networks, its communications networks, its taxation base, all essentially smashed beyond repair. And therefore, visits by UNRWA medical teams and reconstruction agencies were very, very important in terms of recreating that on-the-ground sense of economic change and development. But that relief element, which essentially is portrayed, from the Western side, tended to portray China as a sort of a supplicant, ignored the reality, first of all, that, as I mentioned before, China was, I think, doing a great deal within its own very limited resources to try and domestically deal with the agenda of reconstruction on areas like healthcare, economic development and change, and also, of course, ended the war as a very different sort of actor in international society compared to what it had been in 1937 when the war started. In 1937, China, remember, was still essentially semi-sovereign. Extraterritoriality, special treaty rights of legal immunity for Americans, British, French, and other treaty powers still operated in China as late as the 1930s and 1940s. It was not to 1943 and the middle of World War II that those rights were finally ended. And instead, 2 years after that, China found itself, not least thanks to pressure from President Roosevelt on the British, as the only non-European, and again, the Soviets are problematic, but let's take them as Europeans in this context, the only non-European country to sit as it turned out, a permanent member of the new UN Security Council, but actually also one of the very few countries in Asia which had genuine sovereignty in 1945. A deeply compromised sovereignty, precisely because of the economic weakness that had come from 8 years of war that I've mentioned. But India was not independent at that time, although it would become so fairly soon afterwards. Japan, of course, remained under American occupation for another 7 years, and Indonesia, Malaya, Singapore, a whole variety of other places in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, returned to their European colonizers, despite the promise that had been made by the Japanese invasion that they would eventually be liberated. So this gave China a rather special status, at least during that early, very fluid, very protean period of the creation of an international community at the United Nations, with, in fact, Jiang Tingfu, the Chinese administrator of CINRA, the UNRWA sister organization, then serving as China's first ambassador to the UN, a position he held first on the mainland and then for Taiwan until the 1960s. The stories that I've just mentioned, the story of the wartime nationalist resistance, the story of China holding out until post-Pearl Harbor, the story of China at the United Nations helping to be, in Dean Acheson's phrase, present at the creation of the new world, have not been much discussed until recently. And there's at least one very good reason for that, who sits right there. The trajectory, the narrative of modern China has, for very obvious reasons, in recent decades, been centered much more on the rise to power of Mao Zedong and the communists. And in that sense, you might say, slightly flippantly, in the same way that Philip Larkin claimed that sexual intercourse began in 1963, so for at least some historians, Chinese history or modern history begins in 1949 with the arrival of Chairman Mao in the center of government in Beijing. But in fact, one of the changes that's happened in recent decades, certainly since the 1980s, is a reaction in many ways to this phase of government. You see here Chairman Mao in his pride, in his pomp, at the height of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, the time when China was perhaps singly most isolated from the world, friends neither with the Soviet Union nor with the United States and the Western world, inward-looking, xenophobic, deeply self-harming, you might say. And the 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping took over after Mao Zedong, and when China sought to open up to the outside world again, became a time when actually China began to look once again at its own narrative, rejecting many of the aspects of high Maoism, including the inward-looking turn of the Cultural Revolution, and instead seeking to find elements of the past that might both serve pragmatic political purposes and also help to create a new narrative of national identity. And for those, excuse me, and for those purposes, the Second World War became and has become, because this is a process still very much in the making, immensely important. I've said pragmatic as well as principled reasons. Well, not the two are necessarily separated from each other. First of all, I think it's fair to say that the desire for reunification with Taiwan, which becomes, of course, a continuing theme in contemporary China, was one of the reasons why in the 1970s and 80s in particular, the Chinese mainland became rather more inclined to perhaps soften its view of the former nationalist regime. So Chiang Kai-shek's government, which had been regarded as a sort of feudal relic waiting on Taiwan to invade the mainland, that view rather died down after Chiang and indeed Mao both died in 1975 and 1976 respectively. And instead the idea of cross-straits cooperation, the idea that maybe China and Taiwan had experiences they could share, was more in the air. And of course, no experience could fulfill that more clearly than the experience of the Second World War, when both the nationalists and the communists had been fighting against the Japanese. This also served for a purpose, served the purpose of putting more pressure on Japan at this stage. Relations between Mao's China and Japan were actually fairly low-key and not particularly hostile through much of the 50s and 60s, largely because Mao wished to detach Japan from the Cold War embrace of the Americans. But after the opening of diplomatic relations in 1972, there was more enthusiasm to try and pressure Japan a bit more to atone for its various war crimes in China back in the 30s and 40s. So bringing those memories back became rather more important. And then, as I've said, I think there was a reaction against the kind of radical Maoism of the Cultural Revolution era, and instead a desire to find some source of patriotic pride that more people could share in. And again, for those purposes, the experience of the Second World War became an important touchstone. But in doing so, the Chinese Communist Party therefore also allowed the opening up of previously forbidden or repressed memories of the war, some of which did not conform even with the relatively newer, broader interpretations that were put forward, particularly of the former nationalist regime. So the official position became one that acknowledged, slightly grudgingly, a certain importance to the Chiang Kai-shek government and its resistance to Japan during the wartime years. But this then led the way for more grassroots and more popular reactions that actually much more enthusiastically reappropriated and celebrated those wartime memories. So one example given here, and again for those who read Chinese, you can see it's a book called One Man or One Person's War of Resistance Against Japan. This is written by Fan Jianchuan, one of China's biggest private collectors, who has his own museum outside Chengdu in southwest China, which amongst other things commemorates and celebrates memorabilia specifically from the nationalist armies rather than the communist armies that fought the Japanese during that time, largely because that part of the country, the southwest surrounding Chongqing and Sichuan province, had never under Mao received the sort of praise or opportunity even for mourning of its war dead in a way that had been afforded to the veterans of the communist armies. Also, new, more popular memories or grassroots memories started to emerge. So this book, which is called Going to the Interior of China, it's not a very snappy translation, but it's essentially what it means, is a kind of story which for any Brits in the audience, perhaps more than Americans, will in some ways seem very familiar. In other words, evacuee stories. I will freely confess at this point, and you'll be shocked to hear this, that I was not actually around during the Second World War. But I was a school child growing up in Britain in the 70s, during which children's stories about evacuees being taken out of London and the big cities to the countryside were an absolutely staple part of the narrative that we were given culturally as we grew up. That narrative, which existed in China, was never really publicly discussed until something like 40 years after the events 50 years after the events themselves. Because these people, in this picture, for instance, on a wharf, a waterfront in Shanghai, I think, would ride these steamers upriver, up the Yangtze, not to the communist capital at Yan'an in northwest China, but to Chongqing or other places in the southwest, a choice which after 1949 had become politically incorrect. I recently did some interview work with historians who were growing up in the 1960s and 70s in Chongqing, and I asked them whether there was a difference between what they'd talked about at home and what had been talked about officially with these stories. And they said, of course, at home we talked all about being evacuated and we talked about the experience of Japanese bombs hitting Chongqing, but none of this stuff was put in public because it was all about the nationalist government and not the communists. And it wasn't until the opening up of this particular space for remembering that books like this, which actually is the compilation of some 200 plus, I think, interviews with survivors of that period, could be made publicly available. One of the compilers of this volume told me, speaking to many people who by then were in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, they said, we don't have any fear of dying, you know, we're old and ready to go, but we're terrified that our stories will be forgotten. And that is what these books and these memories are trying to reverse. And then that leads me to the way in which these domestic changes in memory are beginning to filter back into China's changing international position. This is one of my favorite slides. It shows the cover of a DVD of a television show that was broadcast in Chongqing itself about 12 years ago, in 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II. And again, it's called Temporary Capital, and it's supposed, as you can see from the symbols here, the iconic buildings, to be a representation of the Allied wartime capitals. So Elizabeth Tower of the Houses of Parliament for London, the Clock Tower in Red Square for the Soviet Union, Moscow, the US Capitol building there, and on the right, perhaps to many, the less well-known anti-Japanese resistance monument in the center of Chongqing, which is still very much there, although in a slightly rebuilt and different form. For those who don't know the building or don't know the monument, I should say that it is not in fact twice as tall as the US Capitol building, as this picture would imply. The symbolism of that, I think, is not for me to probe. But what this documentary, of course, was putting forward was the idea that China's contemporary international position, its desire to be seen as a responsible actor in international society, as a cooperative actor, as a country that today plays a role in helping to shape international society, not break it up, can be seen in a sense as an inheritor of that previous time when its contribution was made to an Allied victory against dark forces. In other words, the implication, actually it's more than an implication, these days it's more of a statement, that if the United States, more than 70 years after the end of World War II, is able to use its wartime sacrifices in troops and treasure to justify a presence today in East Asia, then China too was present at the creation. China too fought and sacrificed to make that particular world, and therefore China too should be in a position to benefit from that in today's international society. The sleight of hand that, of course, is needed to essentially argue for a continuity between the Kuomintang nationalist government of 1945 and the communist government today is one of those slightly awkward questions that tends to be rather glossed over. But it is, analytically, one of the most important continuities that's now being argued in China, as opposed to the deep rupture that used to be put forward as having happened in 1949. So let me conclude, if I may, by just bringing up why I think that if you go to China today and talk to people, as I say, not just in the world of history, but in the world of policy, they do consider that that immediate moment, the post-1945 moment, which all of us who look at Europe and North America actually for a very long time have considered to be a pivotal moment, is also a pivotal moment in terms of China and in terms of Asia. First of all, the Asian order of 1941 to 45 at the time, and certainly the thinking of Roosevelt as the US president, was done in anticipation of a continued nationalist Chinese role in the region. I think it's very unlikely that Roosevelt would have pushed for a permanent seat for China in the UN if he thought the communists were going to win in just a few years' time. But the irony of today, as I've indicated, is that in many ways today's PRC government in Beijing does claim a continuity, a genealogy that stretches from 1945 to today in terms of China's role in shaping that order. The second point is one that is very much a present-day argument. Is China an actor within the liberal international order, or is it in some way different? Is there, as the Chinese themselves today argue, a different Chinese model of how to behave in international society? And the speech of Xi Jinping at the party congress just a year and a half ago made a much more explicit point about trying to export ideas of order that was very different from previous ideas that China was China, it has its own special characteristics, and they couldn't be exported. But those arguments were very much happening in 1945 as well, when China was part of the Bretton Woods discussions, when China was thinking about nuclear order, when China was thinking about organizations like the ILO and the World Health Organization. Then, of course, third point is that post-colonial identity was something that has a great deal of echo in the present day. China, as I've said, was one of the first few genuinely sovereign non-Western states in 1945, a weak sovereign state, but sovereign nonetheless. Today, of course, China still argues that in many ways it is a mentor for a world in which there are far more states that are sovereign, but do not necessarily wish to be seen as Western or liberal. And finally, the nature of the Chinese domestic state in matters from constitutional change to social welfare is something that was very much, as I've suggested, under discussion in 1945, largely because of that wartime inheritance of many of those questions of what the state could do for the citizen and vice versa. And anyone who knows anything about contemporary China will know that identical debates are going on today about how much the state can provide pensions for rural dwellers as well as urban dwellers. How much right do Chinese today have to a residence permit in a city? How much right do the Chinese have to healthcare and pensions and so forth? All of these are questions that are asked very much in the context of today. The difference being that China today is immeasurably richer than it was by an exponential level compared to 1945. And of course, China today lives, for the moment at least, very much in a world shaped by a long period of peace rather than the immediate aftermath of war. And I say that largely because my very last thought is that I do not wish to suggest that China today is living in the world of 1945. We have had sometimes too many careless comparisons with the Western world, comparing what we're living through now with the world of 1945 or the 1930s or even 1918. And we all know that history is very useful in terms of shaping frameworks, but it doesn't repeat itself directly. But I do think it's important to say that if we are to understand the motivations and actions both domestically and internationally of China today, not necessarily to excuse them or let them go by, but certainly to understand their historical origins, then knowing why the Second World War changed China so profoundly, and why the post-war, the immediate post-war, a period we tend to perhaps skirt over, still has so much valency and significance for the Chinese of today, then revisiting that history as Westerners is something we would be well advised to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this brilliant talk and for showing how relevant it is for historians to explain today's China to us. So I'm sure you have lots of questions, and I don't want to be the first one.
Oh.
There's a microphone coming to the gentleman here, and thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I'm not a question, I'm just making two comments. both about history or use of history to explain your theme. The first thing I think is about the role of Japan. I think you have given too much credit and blame to Japan's role in the shaping of modern China. And I think a book well document the China's today, the search for modern China was, I'm sure you know, it's Jonathan Spence's book, The Search for Modern China.
Yeah.
We need to push that history back at least 100 years. And I want to make one quote to explain the point. Recently, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in commenting on the current U.S. trade with China, this dispute, he made one statement. He said, if we were to sign, I'm a little bit paraphrasing it because I don't know exactly what he was saying. If we were to sign another unequal agreement, we are not going to do it. I think without any explanation, the Chinese people understand exactly what he meant by unequal. And that unequal did not begin with 1937, okay? And
Can we have really short questions because there's so many people who are interested to ask. So no
Why don't we collect a bunch of them, and I can sort of, rather than do it one at a time, and then we'll perhaps you two or three. But sure. So perhaps you want to pick some of those. But thanks for the thought. I'll come back with some comments after.
And can we have Mrs. Epstein over there, please? Yeah. Can we have?
There you go. Let's pass it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask, I'm really fascinated by this, the interplay you described between the domestic and the international, and the analogy to all of these conversations that are happening among the World War II combatants about the world they want to build after the war. As a casual, not expert observer, I sometimes feel that the United States and China are competing to see which can implode first in their competition. And one of the major stressors seems to be their relationship with debt and borrowing. In the US, the kind of co-construction of the warfare state and the welfare state coming out of World War II creates these two enormous interest groups which rely on the same sort of fiscal musculature of the state. And I'm curious, obviously China won't be an exact analogy because it's a one-party system, but is there some sort of negotiation? Are there factions basically within China that are having a sort of similar debate as is occurring in the US today about sort of warfare spending versus welfare spending? Thanks.
Should we take three and then go back to this?
Last one for this one. The lady over there, please.
Thank you. As far as echoes from World War II, when there were certainly tragedies in Europe and in China, what are the words I haven't heard is anything about human rights. And I was very interested in any echoes from World War II that might be present today in internal debates about being part of a liberal order or a non-liberal order.
Okay, so thanks for three excellent points and questions. Let me try and answer them fairly concisely. First of all, in terms of the role of Japan, we could pick this up afterwards as well. I think I would agree with you in the specifics, but disagree in the general, in that I do think that there is something fundamentally different and transformative, not necessarily in a positive way, about Japan's imperial presence during the mid-20th century. Because while the unequal treaties that you're talking about, from the Opium Wars onward, and the presence of the British and the presence of the Americans, in fact, who always forget that they were imperialists in China too from the late 19th century, and the French and so forth, have a profound and very unequal and often very destructive effect on China. The devastation that's caused by the Second World War in particular does strike me as being a really major turning point. I think it's not always useful to go too far into what might have been, because there are so many factors that you can't control for. But I think there is a very strong argument that the nature of the conflicts that were being mediated between domestic Chinese opponents, the communists, the nationalists, and so forth, might have been more capable of resolution, either through negotiation or through one side crushing the other, if it hadn't been for the external shock of an all-out war with Japan. I mean, a war that kills that many people, a war that leads to the division of the country for 8 years into different regimes of control, a war that essentially isolates the country, forces its capital city to an obscure, relatively obscure city in the center, that destroys its tax base, that essentially destroys its fiscal capacity. That is a level of disaster that I think is on a different scale from what happens in terms of the engagement that China has to have with other imperialist actors. So maybe a difference in degree rather than kind, but it's a pretty significant degree, I think. In terms of the factions and spending, yes, absolutely. There are huge debates. I mean, I've mentioned it before, and those who know me and my work will know that I've spent probably too much of my life thinking about Jiang Qingfu, who is a kind of, in a sense, a rather anomalous figure at this time, a Chinese liberal, which is not a very happy position to be in, particularly in the 1940s. But he's inspired by all sorts of ideas, including the election of the Labour government in Britain in 1945, which he finds interesting. He hangs out with the Tennessee Valley Authority in the US during the war. So all of these ideas are in the mix. I think the thing that brings everyone down to earth in the end, and this is a very, very important factor, is that these debates are taking place at a time when there's no money and there's no stability. And one of the things that I think has been, it's sort of understood instinctively but hasn't really been analytically added in enough, is the sheer lack of solid ground on which the post-war Chinese state can be constructed. And this, by the way, I think is as true for the state that eventually emerges in 1949. Because again, one of the things that I think sort of starting the history in 1949 fails to account for fully is the inheritance of that very unstable wartime period, which actually leads to a financially, fiscally, and socially deeply challenged Communist Party, which is then, of course, isolated from large parts of the Western world, largely through its own fault from the Korean War, but also from the decision of the Eisenhower administration not to recognize it, that comes together in a very toxic kind of mix. Again, I don't want to keep, having said I don't want to keep going into counterfactuals, but since you won't tell anyone, I'm sure, I'll venture one here. I think it's harder to imagine the Great Famine of the Great Leap Forward, even if China had maintained the same sort of communist authoritarian state, in a world where China was better connected to the trading system of the outside world and also politically had more interaction with the rest of it. It's not inconceivable, but I think the level of isolation that comes from these factors coming together is a really important and underestimated factor. And the final thing, on human rights, well, actually one of the things I could have mentioned and will mention now as part of that immediate post-war set of debates is, of course, the presence of P.H. Zhang, the Chinese Confucian philosopher, as one of the original signers and contributors to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of the most important things when discussing the question of individual rights in China today is to point out that, as with many other things, as with Bretton Woods, as with the United Nations, China was very much there at the creation. That doesn't obviate arguments which still go on today about whether the capacity of a state to provide enough to eat, employment, and these sorts of things necessarily excludes the importance of individual civil liberties. My personal view is that it doesn't at all. But there's certainly no excuse for arguing, as occasionally is implied in parts of China, that China has not been having these arguments for quite a long time, because it was right there in 1945, 46, and 47, taking part in exactly those debates.
We have, how many more questions do you want to take?
How many you want me to take?
Okay. Mrs. Yu. Yes. Can you wait for the microphone?
Well, let's take another 3 and then we'll say this, and then as long as you want, Karina, that's fine.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I think you're absolutely right about that attempt on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II to revise history, to come up with a different narrative. You mentioned you absolutely noticed 4 veterans of distinguished age who would not otherwise have appeared in the historical narrative. But I also noticed at that time that the change in the official dating of the start of World War II in China, which was 31. And so then Xi Jinping himself made a statement about the Chinese people enduring 14 years of World War II. So, I wonder if that makes any difference to the narrative that you're coming up with. My main question has to do with the PRC, with the kind of stories that they tell each other, not only about World War II, because of World War II, their participation in some of the post-war international events and institutional building, like at the Bandung Conference, like the Afro-Asian Solidarity movement. And therefore, in other words, what is the place of the Chinese Revolution in this narrative? And then the One Belt, One Road project, if we take the railroad just as one instance, and then China built railroads in Africa, and this is also the narrative that they bring out as a way of connecting back to their shared history of colonial experience and all of that. So while we do have this attempt to revise the communist, the dominant narrative, the communists as the winner of World War II, and so that they could include the nationalists in this narrative, expanding the narrative, we also have this other legacy, which takes us back to Afro-Asian Solidarity movement and that other international struggle, and these don't cohere.
Yep.
And so then, in today's China, these legacies are fighting each other. I wonder if you have a
so
comment.
that's a great question. Thanks for that. And we could maybe take 1 or 2 others, and I'll do this just to get people in.
Do you have the gentleman over there?
Thank you. You note properly that China was at the table in the making of the post-war international system, but what fingerprints does one see? One conventionally thinks of the Americans, the Soviets, and the British making the basic decisions, Dumbarton Oaks and so on the UN Charter, and at Bretton Woods for the international financial institutions. So where do Chinese scholars today see something that China had contributed in the making of those institutions? And then in that period, 45 to 49, there were efforts at creating domestically constitutionalism. What became of the so-called third way people who were trying to find space between the communists and the sclerotic Kuomintang after 1949? Did they have space all the way through the 100 Flowers campaign, or were they immediately disappeared?
Great. Should we do one more and then do it? Or?
Yeah, last one. Good and short, please. Who wants to? Oh, there's somebody here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Slight digression. I'm interested in the relationship between Vietnam and China.
Mm-hmm.
I've been told that there's a lot of distrust, if not enmity, between Vietnamese and China. Is that true? And if so, why?
Okay, thanks for 3 very interesting. I think it was actually kind of 3 people but 5 questions, which was a sneaky way of getting it, but I'll do my best to quick fire them. 1931 and the Manchurian incident as the starting point for World War II is now an official Chinese government position, which is promoted by Xi Jinping from 2017. I think I would not share that interpretation, and actually quite a few Chinese historians in private, or even not so private actually, would dispute it as well. Not least because essentially up to 1937 you have lots of phenomena that aren't really war. China's people don't perceive themselves as being at war at the time. There is a brief but real truce between 1933 and 35 in terms of further Japanese expansion. There are diplomats in capitals in Nanjing and Tokyo. The situation is not one of war in the sense that it is after the battles commence in 1937. I think it is not helpful to regard these as being identical phenomena. You can certainly talk about invasions, aggressions, and so forth, but it's a different thing, I think, from war. Your point is a very good one about Bandung. I think what I'd say, though, is that it's important to remember that a large part of that Afro-Asian solidarity, particularly the Asian part, which starts earlier in terms of independence movements, doesn't begin with the Chinese Communist involvement and doesn't begin just with Bandung in 1955. I think if you look, for instance, at a less well-known but actually very interesting event which scholars such as Iti Abraham at National University of Singapore have written about, the Asian Relations Conference of 1946, early 47, held by Nehru in an India that was about to become independent, at which nationalist China and a variety of other countries, some still colonized, some not, were represented. You see the seeds already beginning to emerge of a much more confident post-imperialist Asia, which was essentially defining itself against what had happened at Versailles, or at Paris, I should say, in 1919, where essentially a large number of non-European countries had felt that they had had their fates decided for them by the European powers, and this was not going to happen again. So you see actually documentation from that time that the nationalist government of China is being lobbied by, say, Indonesian independence fighters to actually speak up for them in these new venues and forums. That goes part of the way to, I think, answering the question, or indicating some of the answer to the question about where the fingerprints might lie. First of all, I think it's worth looking, for instance, Eric Helleiner's fantastic book, Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods, does suggest with quite a lot of detail that not just China, but a variety of other non-Western actors, including actually the South Americans, Argentinians and so forth, had a lot more input into shaping ideas of currency controls, tariffs, and so forth in that Bretton Woods moment than has perhaps been realized, hence the title of his book. But I think if you want to look at the area in which a Chinese discourse of anti-imperialism starts to become very powerful, I do think it starts very clearly with the nationalists. They're not the only people who do it, and of course the communists, in a sense, take it up rather as with the welfare ideas I've talked about, as a sort of challenge, a competition of ideas. But one can see that a great deal of what's being said by Chiang Kai-shek's government in terms of how they see post-war Asia being formed is a very uncompromising belief that the newly emergent nations of Asia, first of all, have to be given independence, and also that they're going to do so in the context of a region which maybe will tolerate, American dominance for at least a period, but certainly isn't going to tolerate British and French continuing presence in the region for the kind of length that the Western powers thought that they were going to maintain. So I think, again, we shouldn't underestimate the level of pressure that's being put by China as a newly empowered international actor in terms of the continuing persistence of empire in the region. One other example, actually, is ICAFI, the Economic Commission on Asia and the Far East, which is one of the first international Asia-centered economic development organizations that still exists in a different form today and was centered first in Shanghai in the late 1940s under nationalist Chinese chairmanship, and then moves across Asia as China, of course, falls to a rather different regime. Let me finish with the question about Vietnam. Vietnamese and Chinese tensions are a very long-standing reality, largely because, of course, what we now know or think of as Vietnam is an area that's been under Chinese sovereignty or suzerainty or influence over many hundreds of years. But in the 20th century, essentially, there is a strong argument that the communist solidarity that exists between China and Vietnam in the 50s and 60s, particularly with significant Chinese assistance to the Vietnamese communist liberation movement, as Chiang Jai, the historian, for one, has shown, quickly breaks up into something much more traditional, which is basically Chinese big brother patronizing of the Vietnamese and the Cambodians sometimes as well, actually. There are these transcripts edited by historian Arne Vestad at Harvard of conversations between Chairman Mao and the Vietnamese leaders, in which Mao says things like, what's your name? And, one of the leaders will give his name in Vietnamese. And they say, no, what is it really? In other words, you're supposed to read it in the Chinese method because that's the proper way of reading someone's names. And I'm sure anyone who has a funny foreign name will have the experience of having been annoyed by someone asking what their name is really and why it's so complex to say it. A small example of a wider phenomenon that essentially led to the alienation of the Vietnamese communists from the Chinese, particularly since they wanted to maintain support from the Soviets and the Chinese, and after the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s, it proved impossible for them to do both. So geopolitics was a significant part of it, but a much longer-standing kind of cultural scratchiness between the two sides, which still very much exists today, even though the countries have perfectly good diplomatic relations, and many Chinese tourists go to Vietnam in the present day, but there's still, scratching beneath the surface, a pretty wary relationship between the two sides.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful, stimulating, and very helpful talk.